The fluorescent lights of Gate 47 hummed overhead as Patricia stood frozen, her boarding pass trembling in her hand. Around her, 200 passengers had fallen silent, their phones raised, recording the scene unfolding before them. The gate agent's voice cut through the terminal like a blade. "Ma'am, there's no way you can afford these tickets. Step aside." Patricia's 12-year-old son gripped her hand tighter, his face burning with humiliation. What none of them knew, not the sneering agent, not the whispering crowd, not even Patricia's own children, was that in exactly 9 minutes, the signed contract in her leather briefcase would unravel a $200 million airline partnership. But first, she had to decide, reveal who she really was, or let her family endure this degradation in silence. This moment would expose something far darker than one agent's prejudice. It would reveal a systemic rot that reached the highest levels of corporate America. If you want to see how one woman's quiet dignity became an earthquake that shook an entire industry, subscribe now, because what happens next will restore your faith in justice. The fluorescent lights of Gate 47 hummed overhead as Patricia stood frozen, her boarding pass trembling in her hand. Around her, 200 passengers had fallen silent, their phones raised, recording the scene unfolding before them. The gate agent's voice cut through the terminal like a blade. "Ma'am, there's no way you can afford these tickets. Step aside." Patricia's 12-year-old son gripped her hand tighter, his face burning with humiliation. What none of them knew, not the sneering agent, not the whispering crowd, not even Patricia's own children, was that in exactly 9 minutes, the signed contract in her leather briefcase would unravel a $200 million airline partnership. But first, she had to decide, reveal who she really was, or let her family endure this degradation in silence. This moment would expose something far darker than one agent's prejudice. It would reveal a systemic rot that reached the highest levels of corporate America. If you want to see how one woman's quiet dignity became an earthquake that shook an entire industry, subscribe now, because what happens next will restore your faith in justice. Patricia Washington had arrived at Denver International Airport 90 minutes before her flight to Chicago, her 2 children trailing behind with carry-on luggage decorated with university stickers and debate team medals. Her daughter, 16-year-old Angela, wore her academic decathlon sweater. Her son, Marcus Jr., carried a worn copy of The Souls of Black Folk tucked under his arm. They looked like what they were, an accomplished family heading to a college tour weekend. Patricia's navy blazer was pressed, her leather briefcase monogrammed, her wedding ring catching the harsh airport lighting. Nothing about them suggested fraud or deception. Everything about them suggested exactly who they were. But Sharon Mitchell saw something else entirely. The gate agent's eyes had narrowed the moment Patricia approached the counter, her gaze sliding from Patricia's face to the first-class boarding passes, then back again. The pause lasted just a beat too long. "May I see your identification?" Sharon's voice carried that particular tone, professionally neutral on the surface, edged with suspicion underneath. Patricia handed over her driver's license and credit card without comment. Sharon studied them with the intensity of a jeweler examining a potential fake, tilting the license toward the light, running her finger along the credit card's edge. "And these tickets were purchased when?" 3 weeks ago, Patricia said quietly. Her children flanked her now, Angela's hand finding her mother's elbow, Marcus Jr. pressing close against her side. They'd felt the shift in the air, that electrical charge that Black families learn to recognize. The moment when existing in a space becomes a referendum on your right to be there. Sharon's fingers flew across her keyboard with aggressive precision. "I'm going to need to verify these reservations." Other passengers in the first-class boarding line began to shift uncomfortably, checking their watches, craning their necks to see what was causing the delay. A man in an expensive suit muttered something to his companion. A woman with diamond earrings pulled her Gucci bag closer to her body, as if poverty might be contagious. Patricia said nothing. This was the first test, to defend herself, to produce evidence of her legitimacy, to perform the ritual dance of proving her humanity to someone who'd already decided she had none. Her silence was a choice, deliberate and costly. Angela whispered urgently, "Mom, just show her your work ID. Tell her." But Patricia shook her head minutely. Some lessons, she knew, could only be learned through experience. Today, her children would learn that dignity isn't something you beg others to acknowledge. Sharon's call to her supervisor lasted 4 minutes. 4 minutes while the line behind them grew, while passengers whispered and recorded, while Marcus Jr.'s face transformed from confusion to understanding to shame. Not shame for anything he'd done, but the deeper, more corrosive shame of being marked as suspect in a world that pretended to be fair. When Sharon returned to the counter, her jaw was set with the righteousness of someone convinced they'd caught a criminal. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to call security. There are some irregularities with your booking that need to be resolved." Patricia checked her watch. 3:38 p.m. "What irregularities?" "That's not something I can discuss here." Sharon's hand was already on her radio. The crowd had thickened now, a semicircle of witnesses drawn to conflict like moths to flame. Someone in the back called out, "Just let her through! For God's sake!" But the voice was drowned by another muttering, "I knew something was off." This was America's favorite sport, watching someone be humiliated and pretending it was justice. Angela's voice broke. "Mom, please." But Patricia simply adjusted the strap of her briefcase and asked Sharon a single question that landed like a prophecy. "Before you make that call, I need you to know that I'm asking you, directly, to reconsider. Do you understand that I'm giving you a choice right now?" Sharon's finger pressed the radio button. The choice was made. Security arrived in the form of 2 officers, Trevor and Diane, their name tags announced, though only Trevor looked like he believed he was responding to an actual threat. Diane's eyes swept the scene with the tired recognition of someone who'd seen this script performed too many times. She hung back while Trevor approached with his hand resting casually on his belt, a gesture meant to convey authority without overt aggression. "Ladies and gentlemen, we need this area cleared for a moment," he announced to the crowd. Nobody moved. Everyone wanted to see how this ended. "These passengers have fraudulent tickets," Sharon declared with the confidence of someone who believed the uniform standing beside her validated every assumption she'd made. "I need them removed from the boarding area until we can verify their identities and payment methods." Marcus Jr. had stopped crying, but something worse had replaced the tears, a hollow look that Patricia recognized because she'd seen it in mirrors throughout her own childhood. Her son was learning, in real time, that the world would always demand more proof from him than from others, that his accomplishments would always be questioned, that his presence would always be provisional. 16 years of carefully constructed optimism was crumbling in Gate 47 of Denver International Airport. Trevor cleared his throat. "Ma'am, do you have additional identification? Anything that might help us clear this up quickly?" His tone was gentler than Sharon's, but the question itself carried the same assumption. You must prove you belong. Patricia opened her briefcase. Inside, clearly visible, was a leather portfolio embossed with the Henderson Group logo, a company badge with her photo and title, Chief Investment Officer, and a stack of documents marked Confidential Board Review. She let Trevor see them all. Then she closed the briefcase without removing anything. "I have everything I need," she said. "The question is whether you're going to honor the tickets I purchased or violate the contract your airline agreed to." The word contract hung in the air like smoke. Diane stepped forward then, touching Sharon's elbow, her voice low but urgent. "Sharon, maybe we should get a supervisor down here. This doesn't feel right." For a moment, One brief, shimmering moment, it seemed like reason might prevail. Sharon's expression flickered with something that might have been doubt. Then a businessman 3 people back in line shouted, "Come on! This is ridiculous! Either arrest them or let them board. Some of us have connections to make." The crowd murmured agreement, and Sharon's face hardened with the defensiveness of someone whose authority had been questioned. She couldn't back down now, not in front of all these witnesses. Pride sealed her fate. "I'm canceling all 4 reservations," Sharon announced, her fingers already moving across the keyboard. "You can contact customer service to file a dispute, but you're not boarding this aircraft." Patricia didn't flinch. Instead, she did something that confused everyone present. She checked her watch with theatrical precision and said, "Please note the exact time in your report. 3:27 p.m. Mountain Time. It's important that you document that." Her voice carried across the gate area with unusual clarity, as if she wanted everyone to hear, as if she was creating a record. 30 feet away, partially obscured by a pillar, Marcus Chen had been watching the entire scene unfold. The CEO of TechVantage Industries, scheduled to sit in 2B directly across the aisle from Patricia's 2A, had recognized her immediately, despite her earlier request that he not acknowledge her during the evaluation period. His hand had been hovering over his phone for the past 4 minutes, watching messages pile up from his board members, from his lawyers, from his executive team, all of them asking the same question. Is she still on schedule? Is the deal still happening? When Patricia announced the time, 3:47 p.m., Marcus's face drained of color. He knew exactly what that meant. The deadline had passed. He turned away from the gate, his phone already at his ear, and the single word he spoke carried the weight of corporate catastrophe. Abort. In an executive conference room on the 17th floor of the airline's headquarters building, located in the same airport complex exactly 2,400 feet from Gate 47, 17 lawyers and executives stared at a countdown clock that had just reached 0. Richard Drummond, CEO of Summit Airlines, pushed back from the mahogany table with a sound like a death rattle. Someone asked if they should go down to intervene, but the head of legal shook her head slowly. "Too late," she said. "The contract specified no interference. We were supposed to pass the test on our own." Back at the gate, Sharon was ripping Patricia's boarding passes in half, with the ceremonial flourish of someone exercising what she believed was righteous power. The sound of tearing paper echoed through the suddenly silent terminal. Angela gasped. Marcus Jr.'s hollow expression deepened into something that looked like grief. Not for the tickets, but for the lesson he was learning about how little the world's promises were worth. Patricia's phone began to ring, the tone cutting through the shocked silence. She looked at the screen, then at Sharon, then at her children. "I think," she said quietly, "you're going to want to hear this call." She answered on speaker. The voice that emerged belonged to a man whose panic was barely controlled. "Ms. Washington, this is Richard Drummond. Please tell me there's still a chance to salvage this." Sharon Mitchell's face began its transformation from triumph to confusion, to the first cold fingers of horror. And Patricia Washington, who had endured 9 minutes of public humiliation for a purpose none of them understood, finally allowed herself the smallest, saddest smile. The terminal had gone silent in that particular way that spaces do when everyone realizes they're witnessing something significant, something that will be retold and reshaped in the days to come. Patricia held her phone steady, the speaker icon glowing blue against the black screen. Richard Drummond's voice carried the distinct timbre of a man watching his career collapse in real time. "Ms. Washington, I'm calling from the executive boardroom. We've been monitoring the situation, and I want to assure you that this incident does not reflect the values of Summit Airlines." Sharon's hand went to her throat, fingers pressing against the pulse point as if checking whether she was still alive. The other gate agent, Diane, had backed away slowly, creating physical distance from the disaster she'd tried to prevent. Trevor, the security officer, looked between his radio and Patricia's phone with the dawning comprehension that he'd been cast in the wrong role of this story. "Mr. Drummond," Patricia said, her voice carrying across the gate area with courtroom clarity, "I want to make sure everyone present understands what's happening here. Can you explain to these passengers and your employees who I am and why you're calling me directly?" The pause lasted 3 seconds. In that silence, Sharon Mitchell's entire understanding of the world performed a violent reorganization. "You are Patricia Washington, Chief Investment Officer of the Henderson Group, one of the largest private equity firms in North America. Your company was finalizing a $200 million partnership agreement with Summit Airlines that would have included a complete fleet modernization and expansion into 12 new international markets." Angela's grip on her mother's arm loosened in shock. Marcus Jr. looked up at his mother as if seeing her for the first time, though he'd watched her leave for work in business suits every morning of his life. The businessman who'd complained about connections stood frozen, his face cycling through shades of red. The woman with the Gucci bag had her hand over her mouth. "Was finalizing," Patricia repeated, emphasizing the past tense. "Can you explain to everyone why you're using the past tense, Mr. Drummond?" The CEO's breath crackled through the speaker. The partnership agreement included a clause, Addendum 7, Section 3, that required you to experience our airline services as an ordinary customer during a specified evaluation period. The contract stipulated that any experience of discrimination, profiling, or prejudicial treatment during that period would constitute a material breach of our service standards and void the agreement immediately. Sharon made a sound that wasn't quite a word, more like air escaping from something punctured. She reached for the counter to steady herself, her face now the color of old newspaper. Diane had covered her eyes with one hand, shaking her head slowly. Trevor had removed his hand from his belt entirely, standing with his arms at his sides like a soldier who'd just realized he was fighting for the wrong army. "The evaluation period," Patricia continued, still speaking primarily to the crowd of witnesses, "was scheduled to conclude at 3:47 p.m. Mountain Time today. That's the time I asked Ms. Mitchell to document. The time when her opportunity to correct this situation expired." She turned to face Sharon directly for the first time since the phone call began. "You had 9 minutes. From the moment I asked you to reconsider, that was 3:38 p.m. You had 9 minutes to recognize your mistake, to check with a supervisor, to simply treat me like you would treat any other customer with valid first-class tickets." A younger gate agent, someone who'd been watching from the adjacent counter, burst into tears and walked away. The weight of witnessing injustice that could have been prevented was too much to bear standing still. Marcus Chen had materialized from behind the pillar now, his phone clutched in his white-knuckled hand, watching Patricia with an expression of profound respect mixed with corporate grief. He'd lost a major partnership opportunity, but he was watching a masterclass in institutional accountability. "Ms. Washington," Drummond's voice cracked slightly, "I am personally horrified by what you experienced. I want to offer my sincerest—" "Mr. Drummond," Patricia interrupted, her tone sharp enough to cut, "I don't want your apologies. I want you to understand what actually happened here. Your employee didn't treat me this way because she's uniquely prejudiced. She treated me this way because your systems allowed it, because your training permitted it, because your culture has created an environment where someone can look at a black family with first-class tickets and immediately assume fraud rather than success." Sharon had begun crying now, silent tears streaming down her face, but there was something performative about it. The tears of someone mourning their own consequences rather than their actions. Patricia saw it and felt nothing. She'd cried her own tears years ago, in different airports and boardrooms and spaces where her presence was treated as an intrusion rather than an arrival. Angela found her voice finally, small and confused. "Mom, why didn't you just tell her? Why did you let her keep going? Patricia knelt down, bringing herself to eye level with her son, though her words were meant for her daughter, too. Because, baby, the test wasn't about whether I could prove who I am. The test was about whether they would treat me with dignity without proof. That's what equality actually means. Not having to justify your existence to people who've already decided you don't belong. Marcus Jr.'s eyes were red-rimmed but dry now, and something had shifted in them. Not hardness exactly, but a kind of clarity that comes from disillusionment. He'd learned something today that no parent wants to teach, but every black parent must. That the world will test you differently, judge you differently, and sometimes punish you for having the audacity to succeed. Diane, the security officer who'd hung back, finally spoke up, her voice thick with regret. Ms. Washington, for what it's worth, I'm sorry. I should have intervened more forcefully. I knew this was wrong, and I stayed quiet. Patricia looked at her with something that wasn't quite forgiveness, but might have been understanding. Your silence was violence too, Diane. Quieter violence. But violence nonetheless, Richard Drummond's voice returned, now joined by other voices in the background. Lawyers, executives, people scrambling to contain a disaster that had already metastasized beyond containment. Ms. Washington, is there any possibility, any scenario, where we might salvage some portion of this partnership? The investment we've made in preparation, the market projections, the— Mr. Drummond, Patricia said, standing now and smoothing her blazer. I'm going to disconnect this call. My family and I need to make alternative travel arrangements since our tickets have been destroyed. My legal team will contact your legal team Monday morning to discuss the formal contract dissolution and the discrimination report that will be filed with the FAA, the Department of Transportation, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. I recommend you spend the weekend documenting exactly what happened here, because these 200 witnesses with their phones out have already documented it from their perspective. She paused, looking directly into the camera of the nearest phone, speaking now to the millions who would eventually watch this footage. To everyone who watched this happen and said nothing, you're part of the system too. To everyone who assumed I was lying because my skin color didn't match your image of success, examine that. And to anyone who's ever been treated like I was treated today, your dignity isn't up for debate. You don't owe anyone proof of your worth. Patricia ended the call. The silence that followed felt archaeological, like everyone present was standing in the ruins of something that had collapsed and would never be rebuilt. Sharon had sunk into her chair behind the counter, her face in her hands, her career in ashes around her. The crowd began to disperse slowly, some passengers approaching Patricia with whispered apologies, others fleeing from the discomfort of their own complicity. But one question remained, hanging in the recycled air of Gate 47. What happens now? Patricia Washington gathered her children close, their luggage forming a small fortress around them in the corner of the gate area where they'd retreated to regroup. Angela was scrolling through social media on her phone, watching in real time as videos of the incident went viral. Hashtags already forming, think pieces already being drafted, the machinery of public outrage grinding to life. Marcus Jr. sat silent, processing something too large for immediate words. I need you both to understand something, Patricia said quietly, so only they could hear. What happened today was a test, yes. But not just of the airline. It was a test of how you respond when the world treats you unfairly. I could have pulled out my work credentials immediately. I could have name-dropped my title, thrown my weight around, made Sharon back down through sheer force of corporate power. Why didn't you? Angela asked, and there was no accusation in it. Only genuine confusion from a teenager who'd been raised to believe that credentials mattered, that achievement would protect you, that excellence was armor against prejudice. Because that would have sent the wrong message, Patricia explained, touching her daughter's face with the kind of tenderness that comes from wanting to shield your child from truths you know they must learn. It would have said that I only deserve respect because of my position. That Sharon's treatment of me was wrong because I happen to be important, not because every human being deserves dignity regardless of their bank account or job title. Marcus Jr. finally spoke, his voice carrying a new timbre. Older, somehow, weathered by the last 30 minutes in ways that years of childhood hadn't achieved. But we lost, Mom. She humiliated us, and now we can't even fly to Chicago. Patricia smiled then, sad but genuine. Baby, we didn't lose. Summit Airlines just lost $200 million. Sharon Mitchell just lost her career. Richard Drummond might lose his position as CEO when the board reviews how this happened on his watch. We lost a flight. They lost their integrity. A commotion near the ticket counter drew their attention. A woman in an immaculate gray suit had arrived, flanked by two assistants, moving with the kind of purposeful speed that suggested emergency intervention. She approached Patricia directly, her hand extended, her expression combining professional courtesy with barely concealed panic. Ms. Washington, I'm Janet Reeves, Vice President of Customer Relations for Summit Airlines. I flew here the moment we received the alert from the executive team. I cannot adequately express. Patricia didn't take the offered hand. Ms. Reeves, unless you're here to personally arrest Sharon Mitchell for discrimination, I'm not interested in corporate damage control. Janet Reeves lowered her hand slowly, recalibrating her approach. Ms. Mitchell has been suspended pending a full investigation. Security footage and witness statements are being compiled. We take this matter with the utmost seriousness. You take being caught with the utmost seriousness, Patricia corrected. How many other black families has Sharon treated this way when there wasn't a $200 million contract at stake? How many people experienced exactly what I experienced but didn't have the credentials to make anyone care? The question hung unanswered because everyone knew the answer. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was simply the first one that carried consequences significant enough to matter to people with power. Trevor, the security officer, approached hesitantly. Ms. Washington, I owe you an apology. I responded to a call suggesting fraud without investigating whether the accusation had merit. I allowed someone's bias to become my action. That was wrong, and I'm deeply sorry. Patricia studied him for a long moment. Trevor, do you know what the difference is between you and Sharon? He shook his head. You're asking yourself if you were wrong. She's only upset that she got caught. That's the difference between someone who can grow and someone who can't. She paused, then added, but apologizing to me isn't enough. You need to think about every time you've responded to a call about a suspicious black person and ask yourself if you investigated the suspicion or just validated it. Trevor nodded slowly, the weight of self-examination visible on his face. He walked away carrying something heavier than his equipment belt. The burden of accountability that comes from recognizing your role in perpetuating harm. Marcus Chen finally approached, maintaining respectful distance. Patricia, I know the deal is dead. I understand why it had to be. But I want you to know that TechVantage is prepared to release a statement supporting your decision and condemning what happened here. We won't be flying Summit Airlines for any corporate travel, and we'll be reviewing all our partnerships with companies that demonstrate this kind of systemic discrimination. Patricia nodded acknowledgement. Marcus, I appreciate that. But here's what I really need from you. When you go back to your company and announce this decision, don't make me the hero of this story. Make Sharon the cautionary tale. Make your own employees understand that prejudice costs everyone, not just its victims. A murmur rippled through the remaining crowd as someone recognized the implications. This wasn't just about one destroyed partnership. This was about the broader business ecosystem responding to institutional racism with actual consequences. Companies would sever ties. Stock prices would fluctuate. Summit Airlines would spend years rebuilding trust they'd demolished in 9 minutes. Angela looked up from her phone, her eyes wide. Mom, you're trending nationally. There are already news crews on their way here. Patricia sighed, the exhaustion of the day finally beginning to show in the slight slump of her shoulders. Then we need to leave before this becomes a circus. Janet, she addressed the VP directly. My family needs to get to Chicago. I assume you can arrange alternative transportation that doesn't involve your airline? Janet Reeves nodded quickly. We have a private charter that can depart within the hour. First-class accommodations on any partner airline. Ground transportation. Whatever you need. No, Patricia said firmly. I don't want your charter or your accommodations or your compensation. I'll book my own flights. What I want is for you to take every dollar you would have spent on making me comfortable and put it toward mandatory anti-bias training for every employee at every level of your organization. I want you to create an independent reporting system for discrimination complaints. I want quarterly audits of your hiring and promotion practices. And I want all of that independently verified and publicly reported. Janet opened her mouth to respond, then closed it, recognizing that she had no negotiating position. I'll present your requirements to the executive team. They're not requirements, Patricia corrected. They're suggestions for how Summit Airlines might begin to rebuild some small measure of credibility. Whether they implement them or not doesn't change what happened here or what it will cost. You, as Patricia gathered her children and their belongings to leave Gate 47, the site of their humiliation and their vindication, Marcus Jr. asked one final question. Mom, was it worth it? Making them fail the test when you could have just shown your ID and avoided all of this? Patricia stopped walking and knelt down again, looking her son directly in the eyes. Marcus, you're going to face moments in your life where someone treats you as less than human, and you'll be tempted to pull out every credential, every achievement, every marker of success you've earned, just to make them see you as worthy. But here's what I need you to understand. Your worthiness isn't determined by what you accomplish. You were born worthy. You existed worthy. And the moment you start believing that you have to prove your humanity to people who refuse to see it, you've already lost something precious. He nodded slowly, processing this lesson that would shape how he moved through the world for the rest of his life. As the Washington family walked away from Gate 47, past the cameras that had begun to arrive, past the passengers who would dine out on this story for years, past Sharon Mitchell, who sat hollow-eyed and terminated, Patricia felt the weight of what she'd sacrificed and what she'd won. She'd lost a flight. She'd lost a business partnership. She'd exposed her children to trauma that would require processing and time to heal. But she'd gained something more valuable, a documented case of institutional discrimination that would force systemic change, a viral moment that would spark conversations in boardrooms and living rooms across the country. And most importantly, she'd taught her children that dignity isn't something you negotiate for. It's something you insist upon. Regardless of the cost, 3 months later, Summit Airlines would announce a complete overhaul of their customer service protocols, the termination of 14 employees across 7 airports for similar incidents, and a $50 million investment in diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. The stock price would tank temporarily before recovering. Richard Drummond would resign under pressure from the board. Sharon Mitchell would become a case study in business ethics courses about the consequences of unchecked bias. But in that moment, walking through Denver International Airport with her children flanking her, Patricia Washington wasn't thinking about corporate consequences or viral videos or historical impact. She was thinking about her son's question. Was it worth it? And her answer, whispered to herself as they stepped into the Colorado sunlight, was simple. Every single second. Because some tests aren't designed for you to pass. They're designed to reveal who fails to see your humanity. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is let them fail spectacularly, on the record, with witnesses. The price of dignity, Patricia had learned long ago, was often paid in humiliation. But the cost of silence was always higher.